They didn't die in an accident. They were murdered. The boy looked at me, no tears, only truth. They burned his parents alive for speaking out against child labor. And I walked into a war no one taught me how to survive. If you think this is just another family story, then you're wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss the kind of films you'll never forget. It all began on a rainy afternoon. Among smoked trash and eyes that didn't know fear, the sun slanted through the cathedral's stained glass windows, casting slivers of color across the white silk of the dress that hung untouched on the oak frame mirror. A designer piece flown in from Milan, hand-stitched with lace so fine it shimmered under the filtered light. A quiet, holy kind of beauty lingered in the bridal suite of St. Anne's Church that morning, where Elizabeth Morgan stood barefoot, one hand on her heart, the other holding a steaming cup of jasmine tea that had long gone cold. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself. The tea trembled in her grip. Today was supposed to be everything. A May wedding. Peonies in cream and blush. Guests arriving from Cape Town, Edinburgh, and Accra. Her mother had spent 3 weeks crafting lavender sachets for the reception tables. Her best friend Sienna had booked a gospel choir for the surprise performance after the vows. And there was Nathan, her fiancé, the man who once kissed the tips of her fingers just to make her laugh. They were set to marry at noon. At 9:27 a.m., her phone vibrated. She didn't hear it at first. The cathedral bells had begun their hourly toll, echoing like thunder across London's grey skyline. Elizabeth turned slowly, distracted by the movement on the vanity table. One new email. The subject line was blank. She frowned, opened it. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. I'm gone." That was it. No salutation, no name. 3 sentences typed on a phone. Sent from an untraceable account. At first, Elizabeth thought it was a prank. Some cruel joke from a jaded ex-colleague or a spam bot. Her heart didn't immediately react. It couldn't. The human brain needs time to process betrayal, especially when it crashes in like an unexpected wave. She tried calling him. The number was no longer in service. She called his sister. Voicemail. She called the hotel where he was staying with his groomsmen. "He checked out at 4 a.m., miss. Said he had a flight to catch." The wedding planner knocked on the door. "Liz, time to get your hair touched up." Elizabeth didn't answer. She stood frozen. The phone still in her hand, her body numbing as if the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. Her knees weakened. She lowered herself to the floor slowly, like a dancer folding after the final note of a failed performance. 12 minutes passed before she could blink, 20 before she could cry. When the wedding planner knocked again, this time more urgently, Elizabeth unlocked the door. Her face was calm. Too calm. The type of calm that warns of an oncoming storm. "There's no wedding," she said flatly. "Excuse me." "There's no wedding," she repeated. "He's gone." And with that, she walked out. No screaming. No broken mirrors. No scorned bride tantrum like the films. Just silence. Pure suffocating silence. She left the dress behind. She left everything behind. Out in the corridor, the church florist passed her carrying a basket of baby's breath. She offered a warm smile, unaware of the collapse that had just taken place behind that door. Elizabeth didn't smile back. She couldn't. Her cheeks were paralyzed. As she exited the church, a gust of wind caught her veil, still pinned loosely to her curls, and whisked it away, like a pale bird, into the gray London sky. She didn't chase it. Outside, the city bustled on, oblivious. London doesn't stop for heartbreak. She walked for nearly an hour, winding through alleyways, and past bakeries, her heels clicking against the cobblestone like a metronome. She wandered into Hyde Park and sat beneath a weeping willow wedding makeup smudged under her eyes like mascara war paint. That was when she began to tremble, the kind of tremble that starts in your bones, like your very structure no longer knows how to hold itself upright. Elizabeth wanted to scream, wanted to curl into a child and sob. But her body had other plans. It simply sat. It existed in its own stunned stillness. A couple passed by pushing a stroller. A woman in workout tights jogged past with a golden retriever. The world kept moving. Her world had stopped. By mid-afternoon, Sienna had tracked her down. She knew where Elizabeth went when she was in pain. Always the quiet corners of the city, always near trees. She sat down next to her best friend without a word. Just placed a brown paper bag of pastries between them. Elizabeth didn't reach for it. Sienna waited. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice cracked with the weight of disbelief. I gave him everything, Cien. I moved cities for him. I gave him access to my savings account. I trusted him. I know, Sienna said softly. He didn't just leave me. He erased me. Like I was a phase. Tears welled up again, but she blinked them away. I'm 34. I should know better. Sienna shook her head. You believed in love? That's not a mistake. Elizabeth looked at her hands. She remembered when Nathan had kissed her knuckles after dinner one night, promising, we'll grow old by the sea, Liz, you and me, sunburned and barefoot. He hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen her future. By nightfall, Elizabeth had gone back to her flat. She turned off her phone. Let the messages pile up. She ignored her mother's calls, the desperate texts from bridesmaids, unsure of what to do with 200 seated guests and a 3-tier cake shaped like a cathedral. Instead, she lay on the hardwood floor of her apartment, staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep, just traced the shadows the streetlight cast through the blinds. By morning, she had packed 2 suitcases. She had no plan, no destination, but she couldn't stay in London. Not where every cafe reminded her of him. Not where her office building was just 3 blocks away from the jewelry shop where they had picked out wedding bands. At 6:45 a.m., she boarded the Heathrow Express to the airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers, families hugging goodbye, tourists mapping out itineraries, businessmen talking into Bluetooth earpieces. Elizabeth Morgan sat alone on a metal bench near Gate C32. A wrinkled travel magazine lay forgotten beside her. Her hair was still curled from the wedding. The makeup, now faint and streaked, made her look like a ghost version of the bride she was supposed to be. She stared at the departure board. Ghana, Accra. 9:30 a.m. Flight 221. She didn't know why her eyes stopped on it. Maybe because it was the only destination that didn't sound like an escape. It sounded like a reset. A place she'd heard of only in passing. A country she had once written a paper on in university. Post-colonial education and community empowerment in Ghana. She remembered that paper. She'd gotten an A. She pulled out her wallet. Inside was a postcard Nathan had once given her. On the back he had written, "We'll see the world together, one broken road at a time." Well, the road was broken, and she was alone. Elizabeth stood up, walked to the counter, asked the agent, "Is there a seat left on Flight 221? The woman typed, then nodded. Elizabeth gave her card. She didn't look back. As she walked through security shoes and handbelt unfastened, heart torn, but strangely resolute, she realized something. This wasn't running away. This was survival. She would not be defined by the man who left. She would not be the girl in the white dress, waiting at the altar for someone who never came. She would not spend the rest of her life wondering why she wasn't enough. No, she would begin again. Somewhere where no one knew her name, where no one had ever heard her laugh in happier times, where the land was red and the children laughed barefoot under mango trees, where her broken heart might not feel so loud. And so as the plane took off, leaving behind the skyline of betrayal and dreams unspoken, Elizabeth Morgan closed her eyes and whispered to herself a new vow. I'll find something worth staying for. She didn't know that it wouldn't be love that saved her. It would be purpose. And it was waiting for her down a road of red dust, where the forgotten lived, and where she too would finally be remembered. The plane landed with a hiss of tired brakes and a breath of red dust. Elizabeth Morgan stepped onto the tarmac at Kotoka International Airport with the weight of 2 suitcases and a heart stitched together with just enough silence to keep it from falling apart. Her boots, still bearing bits of London drizzle, met the baked clay of Ghana's soil like a foreign thought trying to enter a native tongue. Heat wrapped around her skin like a shawl, dense, humid, unfamiliar. The air smelled of something she couldn't name. A mix of charcoal fires, rainless earth, and possibility. She didn't know what she expected. Maybe palm trees and smiles. Maybe something cinematic. But Accra greeted her not with charm, but with chaos. Street vendors yelling over taxi horns, children darting between buses, and the city pulsing like a drum under her feet. Obruni, a small voice called from the crowd. She turned. A barefoot boy waved at her with orange soda dripping down his chin. Oh, Bruni. She'd read about it. It meant foreigner or white person. It wasn't meant to insult, but it was a label. And she wore it instantly, like a badge she never asked for. The taxi driver didn't help with her bags. He simply nodded toward the trunk and lit a cigarette while she wrestled with the zipper on her largest case. The ride out of Accra was longer than she expected. 3 hours of sun-bleached billboards, open markets, goats darting across roads, and the endless ribbon of red dirt curling through the countryside. She stared out the window. Ghana was not a postcard. It was real, raw, loud in its beauty and its brokenness. And somehow, it matched the noise inside her. The village of Nyamadua appeared as if summoned from a fable, rusted tin roofs, blue-painted shops with hand-lettered signs, and trees heavy with mangoes swaying over crumbling verandas. Children ran beside the taxi shouting greetings in Twi, the local language. She smiled despite herself. A sign loomed overhead, carved into termite-bitten wood. Nyamadua Community School Knowledge is Power, her new home. The school director, Mr. Badu, waited by the gate. Tall-suited and weary-eyed, he extended a formal hand. Miss Morgan, we thank you for choosing our humble institution. You must be very tired. Elizabeth nodded. It's good to be here. That was a lie. She didn't feel good to be anywhere, but this was her choice, or what was left of it. They walked the grounds. 5 classrooms. No electricity after dark. No glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that clapped in the wind. A single library that was really just a storage closet with a shelf of torn encyclopedias from the 1980s. We are honored to have someone with your qualifications, Mr. Badu said with cautious politeness. Many do not come here. Many prefer Accra, where there is air conditioning. I prefer quiet, Elizabeth said. Another lie. What she really preferred was to disappear without anyone asking too many questions. She was shown to a small staff house behind the school where a mattress lay directly on the floor, and a mosquito net drooped from a bent nail in the ceiling. No fan, no shower, just a bucket and a spigot in the corner. Still, she unpacked, hung her dresses, stacked her books, lit a candle, and stared at the flame for a long, long time. The next morning, the air was thick with rooster calls and the scent of fried dough. She wore a modest blouse and skirt and arrived to the schoolyard where children barefoot and grinning played football with a ball made of tied plastic bags. She introduced herself in the teacher's lounge. The other teachers gave nods, some smiled politely. But there was something behind their eyes. Something like suspicion, or maybe exhaustion. The English teacher, Miss Araba, was the first to speak. You are the volunteer, she asked flatly. Elizabeth nodded. For 6 months. I'm here to assist in English literature and conversation. Araba looked her over. You came alone. Yes. Brave. The way she said it, it didn't sound like a compliment. During her first class, Elizabeth met 26 students packed onto 4 benches. No airflow. One chalkboard half erased from the previous day. She smiled, began a lesson on storytelling structure, but her accent confused them. She tried to slow down, drew diagrams, laughed awkwardly when no one laughed with her. At lunch, she sat under the almond tree, eating rice from a tin and sipping warm water. No one joined her. Later that week, she learned why. She overheard 2 teachers whispering outside the staff room. She thinks she'll fix us, just like the others. They come take photos and leave. She's another O'Bruni with a savior complex. Elizabeth stood still, back pressed to the cement wall. She didn't cry, not this time. She understood their bitterness. Volunteers had come before Young Loud, Instagrammed their charity, then vanished with hashtags and scholarships. But she wasn't here for that. She didn't even know why she was here, not really. Still, it hurt, because she had nothing left to prove otherwise. On her 3rd Friday, she tried to organize a reading circle after class. She brought out Matilda, her favorite childhood book, and invited the students to sit under the tree. Only 5 came. By page 6, 3 had dozed off. Kwesi, a bright-eyed boy of 10, stayed behind after the others left. Miss, he asked, you are not like them, are you? Elizabeth tilted her head. Like who? The ones who teach for pictures? Her throat tightened. No, she said. I don't even like cameras. Kwesi nodded. Good. Then maybe you stay. But the days dragged like sacks of wet sand. There were moments she questioned her decision. The insects, the food, the way her skin itched under the mosquito net, the constant power outages, the sound of drumming late at night that both fascinated and frightened her, and the silence, the kind that echoed her own. One evening, she attempted small talk with Araba. "Do you ever feel like you're not meant to be a teacher?" Araba raised an eyebrow. "You ask strange questions, O'Bruni." Elizabeth shrugged. "I suppose I do." Araba sighed, then softened. "You are not the first to come with broken eyes." "Broken what?" "That look," Araba pointed gently. "Like you are far from home, even when standing still." That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling fan that didn't spin. She listened to the cicadas humming like an ancient lullaby. She thought of her bridal veil still tucked at the bottom of her suitcase, stuffed between a passport and a bottle of paracetamol. She rose, stepped outside barefoot. The ground was warm, dusty, alive. She walked beyond the school fence and followed a trail of red clay lit only by the moon. She didn't know where it led, but the night was kind. And for the first time in weeks, her heart didn't feel quite so loud. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, a real belly-deep laugh. And Elizabeth smiled, not because she was happy, but because maybe, just maybe, she was finally in the right kind of wrong place. Not a sanctuary, not a plan, but a beginning. And beginnings never ask permission. They just come quietly under moonlight, on roads painted in red dust. The rain came without warning. It began as a warm breeze through the almond trees near the schoolyard, then thickened into a gray smother that swallowed the sun whole. The clouds, swollen and angry, cracked open over Nyamadua, like grief that could no longer wait its turn. Elizabeth had intended to make a short visit to the district market, a half-mile walk for tomatoes and kerosene. But somewhere along the winding dirt path, she took a wrong turn, a left instead of a right, a footbridge instead of the main road, a muddy fork that looked familiar but wasn't, and just like that, she was lost. The red dirt path bled into tar, then into gravel, then into something that wasn't a road at all, just an open sprawl of decay and metallic ash. Smoke curled from burning piles of e-waste plastic casings, computer wires, copper coils stripped raw and reeking of something poisonous. Elizabeth paused, squinting through the drizzle. This wasn't Nyamedua. This wasn't even near it. She had wandered into a place she'd only heard of in warnings, Ogbogblashie, the slum known for its vast electronic graveyard. An open-air dump of discarded machines from the West turned into a livelihood for those who lived on its edges. It was where the unwanted things of the world came to rot, and where the forgotten came to survive. The rain grew heavier. Each drop struck the tin roofs like a threat. The air was thick with the smell of burning plastic, rotting food, and wet cardboard. Dogs barked in the distance. A baby cried behind a sheet-draped doorway. Elizabeth wrapped her scarf tighter around her face, hoping to disguise her foreignness. But it was impossible. Her skin, her posture, her eyes, they betrayed her with every step. She pressed forward slowly, scanning for an exit, some familiar landmark, anything. That's when she heard it, a scuffle. Not the kind that belongs to a street argument, but something sharper, urgent. She turned a corner and stopped. There, near a mound of burning motherboards, stood a boy no older than 11, his arms spread wide like a human shield. Behind him, 2 younger girls, twins, perhaps trembling, soaked one, clutching a faded pink teddy bear, the other barefoot and silent. In front of him, a man, gaunt, shirtless, eyes bloodshot with fury and withdrawal. He was screaming in Twi, slurring words between coughs, swaying like a snake ready to strike. In his hand was a rusted iron rod. It gleamed under the gray light, deadly despite its age. Elizabeth didn't think. She stepped forward. "Hey!" The man froze. The boy turned. Their eyes locked. She raised her voice. "Leave them alone!" The man sneered, blinking at her like she was a hallucination. Then he spat. "O'Bruni, go home." He didn't say it with fear. He said it like a warning. Elizabeth's heart raced. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Every fiber in her body screamed retreat, but her feet didn't move. "They're children," she said firmly. "Leave them." The man staggered toward her. The rain fell harder. Her breath caught. He raised the rod. And then, like a flash, Kwame moved. The boy didn't wait for backup. He charged at the man's knees with a shout, catching him off guard. The rod clattered to the mud. The man cursed, shoved Kwame hard, then glanced at Elizabeth again, just long enough to see she hadn't flinched. And then he ran, vanished into the smoke like he was part of it. Silence, just rain, just breathing. Elizabeth rushed forward, kneeling next to the boy. "Are you okay?" He nodded, wiping mud from his lip. He does that sometimes. Elizabeth looked over his shoulder. The girls were still huddled, frightened, but unharmed. "Your sisters?" He shook his head. "Cousins." She offered her hand. He didn't take it, just stared. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know. People like you. They don't come here unless they're lost." "I am," she admitted. "Very." He stood. Short, wiry, filthy. His shirt had more holes than fabric. But his eyes were clear. Sharp, like glass that had seen fire and still held form. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He hesitated. Then, "Kwame," she smiled. "Kwame. That's a strong name." He squinted. "You're the first person to ask." That hit her like a whisper through bone. He wasn't being dramatic. In this place where names were as expendable as wire and ash, no one had ever stopped to wonder who he was. Only what he could carry, what he could burn, what he could sell. Elizabeth knelt lower. "My name's Elizabeth." He nodded, not quite sure what to do with that information. "Where are you from?" he asked. "England." "Why are you here?" She looked around. At the fire, the smoke, the wet earth littered with fragments of other people's lives. Then she looked back at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. Kwame shrugged as if that made sense. Maybe it did. Maybe people didn't need reasons to end up in hell. Maybe it was enough just to survive it. He turned to the girls and whispered something in Twi. One of them started to cry. He picked her up effortlessly, balancing her on his narrow hip. "You should go, Elizabeth, from England. Will you be okay?" He paused. "We always are." She didn't move. Something in her resisted. She wanted to do something, anything. Offer money, shelter, a phone number. But she knew better. This wasn't a place for promises. So she reached into her bag, pulled out a granola bar she had kept for lunch. It wasn't much, but it was real. He took it, hesitated, then tore it in three and gave the biggest piece to the girl on his hip. Elizabeth smiled. Kwame didn't. He just nodded. And then he turned, leading the girls back into the smoke, vanishing behind the ribs of an old refrigerator and the ghost of something that used to be a television. Elizabeth stood there, soaked through, heart roaring like thunder. She didn't know how long she stayed. When she finally turned around, the streets were emptier. The rain had lessened. She followed the path back, retracing her steps past corrugated metal and burned-out kiosks. But something had shifted. It wasn't just her direction. It was something inside her. She had looked into the eyes of a child who had nothing, and yet had protected someone else. A boy who had been treated like debris, but stood like a warrior. And she had felt seen, not by charity, not by pity, by truth. The kind that demands you either look away or do something about it. She chose not to look away, not anymore. That evening, back in her room, Elizabeth peeled off her soaked clothes, wrapped herself in a blanket, and stared out the window. The candle flickered weakly on her desk, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. She thought of Kwame, of the rusted rod, of the way his voice didn't tremble when he said his name. She whispered it to herself. Kwame. It meant born on a Saturday. She didn't know why that detail mattered, but it did, because now she remembered him, and that meant he mattered. She closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come, but something else did. A seed. Small, quiet, but breathing. Something had begun, and she knew deep in the marrow of her silence that she hadn't found Agbogblashi by accident. Agbogblashi had found her, and it had sent a boy named Kwame to ask her the questions she'd been afraid to answer. What are you going to do now? The morning after she met Kwame, Elizabeth woke to a quiet resolve. It wasn't the type of awakening that came with trumpets or epiphanies. No. It came with the sound of wind pushing tin against tin, with smoke drifting across her window like a warning and a calling. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She packed her canvas satchel with whatever tools she could find, half-used chalk. 3 broken pencils, a tattered children's dictionary, and the only English novel she'd brought from home, The Little Prince. When she stepped outside, the sun was already high, and the heat heavy like the land itself was daring her to retreat. But she didn't. She walked straight past the almond tree, past the murmuring staff room, past the look Miss Araba gave her, half worry, half disdain. She walked out of the village, across the brittle bridge, and back into Agbugbloshi. Back into the smoke, back into the wreckage. Children scurried barefoot across the wasteland, their laughter thin but real, echoing off piles of shattered printers and rusted air conditioners. Dogs slept curled beneath heaps of cracked monitors. A group of boys squatted near a fire burning wires to harvest copper. Their faces were blank, immune to the sting of toxic smoke. Elizabeth passed them and stopped near the ridge of a slope overlooking the main trash field. There was a broken metal shed there, half-roofed, its sidewall missing. It wasn't much, but it was shade. Shelter. Space. She moved fast. With a stone, she scratched a grid into the dirt, her makeshift classroom. Then she propped up a sheet of corrugated tin against the remaining wall and smudged it with charcoal until it was dark enough to write on. Her fingers trembled as she wrote the first word, dream. She stepped back. Then she waited. At first, nothing. Then a boy peeked from behind a heap of steel. It was not Kwame, but someone smaller. Curious. The boy moved closer. She smiled. Class is open, she said. By midday, there were 5. 2 girls, 3 boys, dirty, barefoot, one with a swollen eye, another with a nose that never stopped running. But they sat. They sat on trash bags, on rusted appliances, on the bare earth. And they listened. Elizabeth began with the alphabet. She shaped the letters slowly in the air, letting her hands dance as she spoke. A, B, C. Some repeated after her, some didn't. One fell asleep. But one girl Amma watched with the intensity of someone who knew this was rare, precious. After an hour, Elizabeth told them a story. Once there was a boy who lived on a small planet. She didn't finish, because by then they were smiling. Not because they understood everything, but because she was still there. The next day, there were 12. The day after 15. They came barefoot, hungry and shy. They came late. They came early. They brought nothing. But they came. Elizabeth taught what she could. Numbers on crushed cardboard. Words on tin. She used soda bottle caps to teach counting. Pieced together English sentences from comic book fragments found in the garbage. She taught them to hold pencils like they were keys, and she made them laugh. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about it was. They had no paper, no chairs, no protection from the rain, but they had each other. And for the first time, they had someone who didn't see them as waste. But the world noticed, and not kindly. On the 3rd week, a group of men from the village stood on the edge of the trash field, watching. Their arms crossed, their mouths set. By the 4th week, rumors had spread. They said the white woman was creating a circus in the slums. They said she was corrupting the children, making them believe they could be more than their fathers. They said she would leave them heartbroken, just like the others. At the school, Mr. Badu called her into his office. He folded his hands across a Bible. Miss Morgan, he began. We appreciate your enthusiasm. She sat silent. But teaching outside the school grounds is not standard. It creates confusion. For who, she asked. For the children. For the community. Elizabeth leaned forward. Sir, these children don't even attend your school. They're scavengers. They live in places without walls, without food. They've never been inside a classroom. And perhaps, he said gently, that is because God did not place them inside one. She felt her pulse spike. Then maybe it's time someone did. He frowned. You must understand this isn't London. We have ways here. Order. You're creating disruption. She stood. So be it. Word spread quickly. Miss Morgan was the disruptor. Parents warned their children not to waste time with the woman who plays teacher in the dump. Other teachers grew colder. Araba wouldn't meet her eyes. The headmistress began losing her supply requests. Elizabeth returned to the trash field every afternoon anyway, and the children kept coming. One day she found a note under a rock near her chalkboard. It read, "You don't belong here. You're making a mess. Go home before someone makes you." No signature. She folded it once, slipped it into her satchel, then picked up a piece of charcoal and wrote on the tin board, "What is courage?" The next day, more children showed up. One of them was Kwame. He didn't speak, just stood near the back and watched. His cousins were already there, sitting cross-legged and giggling at Elizabeth's awkward attempt to pronounce their names. She met his eyes. He didn't smile, but he stayed. That night, she lay awake in her dark room, listening to the wind push against the shutters. The mosquitoes were relentless. The lantern had died. But her mind was on the children on Amma who had sounded out the word star today for the first time and then clapped as if she'd touched one. Elizabeth closed her eyes. The smoke, the rust, the stench, the poverty, the ridicule. It didn't matter because she had seen something. Not in the world, but in them. She had seen beginnings, and she knew deeply, surely, without doubt, that beginnings never bloom in polished places. They bloom in broken ground. And what better place to teach children to grow than from the ashes of what others throw away? The smoke over Agbog Blashi grew thicker with the heat of early July, curling like black ribbons above rusted heaps of tech waste. It had been nearly 6 weeks since Elizabeth Morgan opened her first class in the open pit, 6 weeks since she began chiseling dreams out of ash and steel. And someone had finally noticed, but not the kind of notice she hoped for. It started with whispers. A boy named Samuel stopped showing up. Then Akua, one of the sharpest girls in the group, arrived with a swollen eye and a silence too heavy for her 10-year-old shoulders. Elizabeth crouched beside her, cupping her chin gently. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. Akua said nothing. Later that day, Elizabeth found one of the older boy's yaw hovering near the edge of the field. His shirt was torn, his voice flat. "They warned us," he muttered. "Said we shouldn't come here anymore." "Who warned you?" "The men with boots. From the scrapyard. They say we belong to them." Belong. The word made Elizabeth nauseous. That night, she didn't sleep. She scoured reports on her cracked tablet, UN documents, exposés, journalistic scraps. The truth was already known, but conveniently ignored. Agbog Blashi wasn't just a dump. It was an unregulated labor zone hiding beneath the blur of recycling. Children were currency here, bought with food, leased with fear. And now those children were being told they could not learn. The next day, Elizabeth walked straight into the district office. The air-conditioned lobby felt like another country. Leather chairs, polished floors, a secretary with glossy nails who looked at her like a smudge. "I need to speak with Director Mensah," Elizabeth said. The woman didn't move. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's urgent." She waited 3 hours. When she was finally ushered in, the room was lined with mahogany panels, and Director Mensah, balding, bored, and barefoot behind his desk, didn't look up. "Speak. I'm here about the scrap lords in Agbog Blashi. They're using children for labor-violent conditions. Some of them are being harmed for trying to attend school." He finally looked at her. "Which school?" "My class. Informal." "Then it is not a school. It's education. It's interference." Elizabeth stiffened. "You're telling me teaching a child their name is interference?" Mensah leaned back. "You don't understand how things work here, Miss Morgan." "I understand enough." "No, you don't. These men, these operations feed entire families. You disrupt their flow, and the whole economy trembles. They're hurting kids," he sighed. "And if you keep pushing, they'll hurt you too." There it was. The unspoken threat in full daylight. Elizabeth stood. "If anything happens to one of those children, their blood is on your hands." "Careful," he warned. "You're a guest here. Guests can be asked to leave." She walked out before he finished the sentence. Her hands shook the whole way back. By the time she returned to the slum, Kwame was waiting. He was barefoot, sweaty, his shirt darker with soot than fabric. "They know," he said. "They came to my shack last night. Asked where you lived." Elizabeth knelt in front of him. "Are you okay?" He shrugged. "I've been worse." It was meant to comfort her. It didn't. That week attendance dropped in half. Then came the attack. It was a Tuesday. Class had just ended. The kids scattered to their hideouts, giggling, hugging books wrapped in plastic to shield them from the drizzle. Elizabeth stayed behind to clean. She heard it before she saw it, the wet slap of something hitting flesh. A scream. Then the sharp bark of a man's voice. She ran, past the burned-out microwave, past the cracked car door, serving as a fence. There beneath the frame of a broken copier lay Isaac, 9 years old, beaten, nearly unconscious. His arm was bent wrong. Blood ran from his ear. A man in a red scarf stood over him, muttering curses, wiping his fists. When he saw Elizabeth, he didn't run. He smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that said, "This is what happens when you teach dogs to dream." She fell to her knees. "Isaac, Isaac, can you hear me?" The boy blinked, tried to nod. She looked up. The man was gone, like smoke. She carried Isaac to the clinic herself. He was unconscious before they reached the gate. The nurse looked at her like she was poison. "You bring this filth in here," she snapped. "He's a child. He's from there." Elizabeth's voice trembled. "He's hurt." The nurse relented. They admitted him. No ID, no family, no questions asked. Elizabeth sat in the hallway for 6 hours. When the doctor emerged, he didn't mince words. "Fractured rib. Possible concussion. He'll need weeks to recover. I'll pay." "With what?" She opened her satchel, pulled out a thin wad of cash, most of what she had left, laid it on the table like it was her last piece of dignity. The doctor took it. She returned to her room that night and wept until her stomach cramped. Not just for Isaac, for everything. For the silence of the teachers who knew, for the parents who feared, for the officials who shrugged, and for herself for believing that goodwill could outmatch a system built on fear and rot. She wanted to quit. She wanted to leave, to go back to England where pain at least came with clean hospitals and quiet apologies. But the next morning, a knock on her door woke her. Kwame. He stood there with 6 children. Each held a rock. Each one had written a word on it in chalk. Elizabeth stared at them, speechless. Kwame stepped forward. "You can't go. Not now. They're watching." "Who?" "Everyone." And suddenly she knew. She wasn't just teaching a few kids to read. She was pulling back a curtain no one wanted opened. And now she had to decide. Close it again, or tear it down completely. There are days that break you. And then there are days that build something inside you from the wreckage. For Elizabeth Morgan, it began with a click. Just one. A small sound at the top of a web browser in a crowded internet cafe in central Accra. The screen was old, the mouse sticky, and the air stank of fried yam and dried sweat. But when the notification popped up, auction complete. Funds transferred, her breath caught. She had sold it, the last piece, her grandmother's flat in York. The one she'd inherited, the one she swore she'd never let go of. Gone, liquidated into a thin line of digits. Just enough. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't noble. It was survival. That afternoon, she signed a lease for a derelict warehouse on the fringe of Ogbog Bloshi. A building long forgotten with its roof caved in at the corners and its windows punched out like broken teeth. The owners were eager to rent it out. No one wanted it. No one needed it, except her. She stood in the center of the dusty concrete floor and imagined walls not rotting, but repainted. She imagined rows of desks, a library in the back, fans spinning on the ceiling, a chalkboard without rust. She could see it all, even if no one else could. She hired 3 local masons, paid them up front, bought tin sheets from the scrapyard and plywood from a second-hand dealer. She bartered for leftover paint from a church restoration in Accra and begged a local seamstress to sew makeshift curtains from discarded kente cloth. The children helped. Kwame brought 6 boys to haul bricks. Amma scrubbed the floors with soap she stole from a cousin's job. They came every afternoon barefoot, hungry, laughing. They painted. They swept. They carried wood like soldiers with a cause. Elizabeth worked until her fingers blistered and bled. When the power failed, they built by lantern light. It took 21 days, and on the 22nd the doors opened. No fanfare, no ribbon, just a wooden sign nailed over the doorway with uneven letters that read, Red Earth Academy, named not for its pain, but its promise. Elizabeth stood at the entrance, her dress damp with sweat, her arms sore and tears swimming in her eyes. The children streamed in. There were 45 of them now. Some had never seen a desk. Others touched the walls like they were sacred. There was no bell to mark the beginning of the first class, only the whisper of hope. But that was enough. In their first week, Elizabeth taught basic phonics, basic math, and big dreams. She showed them books, real books, donated by a missionary school in Cape Coast, shipped to Red Earth in banana crates. She introduced the students to stories about astronauts, inventors, orphans who became kings. She made them repeat the words, I am capable, before every lesson, not out of ritual, but because they needed to believe it before anyone else would. She still fought the system. The local education board refused to acknowledge her. The district refused to offer her a permit. But something changed. The children began speaking English at the market. They began asking questions at home. And Kwame began to speak differently. One afternoon, after a lesson on persuasive writing, he stayed behind and asked Elizabeth for help. "I want to write a speech," he said. "What for?" "There's a regional contest next month. The prize is a scholarship to a proper school in Accra." Elizabeth studied him. "Do you want to leave here?" "I want to be heard." She helped him craft the speech over the course of 2 weeks. They worked late into the night under oil lanterns amid the chirping of crickets and the crackle of distant fires. Kwame memorized every word, practiced every pause, refined every gesture. When the day came, Elizabeth dressed him in a white shirt 3 sizes too big and borrowed slacks held together with a safety pin. She couldn't afford to travel with him, so she gave him a worn backpack and a hug tight enough to leave fingerprints on his ribs. He took a trotro to the city alone, and he returned a champion. The day he came back, the whole community was waiting. Not just the children, not just Elizabeth, but mothers, shopkeepers, even Mr. Badu standing awkwardly on the fringe. Kwame climbed onto a rusted metal drum and held up the certificate. First place, out of 78 competitors. His speech had been on the theme, "What I Wish the World Knew." He had ended it with the words, "We are not scrap, we are seeds." Someone in the audience had filmed it. It went viral, not globally, but enough. Enough for the video to land on the desk of a journalist at the Ghanaian Observer. 3 days later, Elizabeth found herself sitting across from a woman in heels too sharp for the dirt, scribbling notes furiously. "You built a school from trash." "No, I built it from belief." The article ran the following Sunday. Headline, "The O'Bruni Who Taught Hope Among the Wreckage." Within a week, they had a donation from a Ghanaian diaspora group in the UK. Within 2, an education nonprofit visited. Within 3, Elizabeth was invited to speak on a local radio station. And the whispers began to shift. She's still here. She didn't run. She built something. For the first time since she arrived, the town's suspicion began to give way. Not to admiration, not yet, but to curiosity, which was a beginning. Kwame came to her that night as the children were cleaning the classroom. He sat beside her on the stoop. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Of what?" "That they'll take this away. That it's too good." Elizabeth looked at him. "They might try," she said. "But you're stronger than they know." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen the fire. And I've seen what you built with it." He was silent for a moment. "Then I want to be a lawyer one day." She smiled. "You will be." He turned to her eyes, lit with a kind of wonder that belongs only to those who've seen darkness and still dare to believe in light. "You think so?" "I know so." He nodded. And under the cracked sky beside the academy, born of broken walls and blistered palms, a seed grew deeper into the earth. It didn't need permission. It only needed someone to believe it could. The opening ceremony of Red Earth Academy began with thunder, not the kind that cracked the sky, but the kind that hummed beneath your skin. The kind that whispered something is shifting. Boys in oversized shirts. Girls with braids wrapped in borrowed ribbons. Mothers holding infants standing under umbrellas made of plastic sheets. They all gathered outside the tin and plywood schoolhouse, staring up at the banner Elizabeth had painted herself the night before. Red Earth Academy. Knowledge grows here. She had barely slept. Her hands still smelled of paint thinner and lemon oil. Her shoes were soaked from the morning rain, but her heart burned bright. She stood before them, a woman with no pedigree, no government stamp of approval, no security. Only a voice. Only a vision. She spoke slowly, clearly. "I built this place with the help of your children," she said. "With your courage. This school is not a gift. It is a right." There was silence, then applause. And when she introduced Kwame as the student ambassador, the crowd erupted. He stood tall in his crisp white shirt, scars still visible on his wrist from the scrap fires of weeks past. But his voice did not tremble. "This school isn't perfect," he said. "But it's ours. And no one can take what we build with our own hands." Cheers, laughter, tears. A choir of neighborhood girls sang a local hymn in harmony. Elder women danced in circles. The scent of fried plantain filled the air. It felt sacred. Elizabeth stood by the door, eyes brimming, watching generations collide beneath a roof stitched together by willpower and red dust. They had done it, and for a brief golden moment, it felt like it would last forever. That night, Elizabeth didn't sleep at the academy. She stayed at the clinic with Amma, who'd come down with a fever during the event. Kwame offered to stay behind and keep watch over the building along with his little sister, Essie. At midnight, the world shattered. The fire started at the back, likely through a hole in the sheet metal wall. A flame born of gasoline poured by a coward ignited the old crates stacked as bookshelves. The building lit up like dry brush. Kwame woke to smoke. He grabbed Essie, who'd been sleeping on a cot in the reading nook, and dragged her toward the exit. But the front door was blocked by fallen wood. Flames licked at the tin walls, turning them into red-hot blades. He kicked a hole through the side wall just enough to shove Essie out through a nest of wires and ash. Then the roof collapsed. He didn't make it out in time. They found him under a beam, half-conscious, his back burned, his breath ragged. Someone ran to fetch Elizabeth. She arrived barefoot, sprinting across mud and gravel, dressed, torn, eyes wild. And there, under the smoky shadow of what had been their school, she dropped to her knees beside the boy who had called her brave. Kwame, she whispered. Oh God. Oh my God. He opened one eye. Is she safe? Elizabeth nodded, sobbing. He passed out. The rest of the night was a blur. Sirens. Buckets of dirty water. A nurse stitching wounds by flashlight. Children crying in corners. Men whispering of curses. Women praying with trembling palms. By morning, all that remained was a skeleton of ash. Books turned to black pulp. Desks charred to bone. Elizabeth sat in the rubble, staring at her hands. They were covered in soot and blood. She couldn't move, couldn't think. They had burned everything, not just wood. Belief. That afternoon, the district police stopped by. 2 officers. One tall, silent, one round and loud. They handed her a letter, a formal warning, operating an unauthorized learning center, inciting disruption in the community, encouraging unregulated assemblies of minors. No arrests, no investigation into the arson, just paperwork. A quiet threat wrapped in a bureaucratic bow. Elizabeth didn't cry. Not then, not even when Araba showed up, guilt softening the edge of her voice. You should go, she said, before they make you disappear. Elizabeth said nothing. She packed her satchel that evening. By dawn, her ticket was booked. London, one way. She didn't tell the children. Didn't say goodbye. She walked alone through the market, past the women who'd once danced, past the boys who'd carried bricks, past the old men who now looked away. At the trotro stop, she waited, hands folded, eyes hollow. She had fought. She had built, and it had burned. What more was she supposed to give? The trotro approached. She reached for her bag and heard the voice. You would leave him now. She turned. An old woman stood in the shade of a mango tree. Skin like ancient leather, eyes like molten gold. Elizabeth blinked. I don't know you. You don't need to. The woman stepped closer. But I know what you've done, and what you're trying to run from. I have nothing left, Elizabeth rasped. They won. The woman nodded slowly. People with fire in their hearts always burn twice. First for themselves, then for others. Elizabeth's lip trembled. I can't do this again. You already did. You turned trash into a sanctuary. You made a boy who thought he was nothing believe he was something. Tears pooled in Elizabeth's eyes. Kwame is still breathing, girl. You don't abandon the fire just because it burned you. You learn to hold it better. The trotro honked. Elizabeth looked down at her hands, still stained with soot, still shaking, still hers. She turned, walked away from the bus, back through the dust, back through the market, back into the ruin, where children were waiting in the shadows, and one by one they stepped into the light. Not because she called them, but because, even when the walls were gone, they knew the school still lived. Inside them, inside her, and that could never burn. Ash still coated the walls. The ground was a black quilt of cinders and memory. Charred pages fluttered through the breeze like dying birds. The smell of melted plastic lingered in the air for days, days when Elizabeth Morgan barely spoke, barely moved, barely breathed. But it was not silence that changed things. It was sound. 1 hammer, then 2, then 10. It began the morning after she walked away from the trotro and into the ruin. Elizabeth arrived to find Kwame sitting upright on a wooden crate, one arm in a sling, his other hand clutching a stick he had sharpened into a walking cane. I'm not dead, he said flatly with a trace of a smirk. She smiled, lips trembling. That same afternoon, the first group came. A mason from the village. a mother of 5. 2 older students from the main school. No one asked permission. They just brought things, broken bricks, buckets, sheets of tin, and started stacking. They didn't speak of what was lost, only what could still be built. News spread. By day 3:30, people were at the site. A teenager carried his father's wheelbarrow. An old woman arrived with a sewing machine strapped to her back for the uniform, she said. A carpenter donated a cracked door and refused to be paid. Children carried stones in baskets on their heads barefoot, singing as they moved. And on the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. They began writing names, not on desks, not on chalkboards, but on the walls. In chalk and paint and char, they inscribed their children's names, each family claiming a spot. Ajoa, age 8. Kweku, the dreamer. Emmanuel loves numbers. Even the men who once whispered that Elizabeth was a disturbance came silent but steady with their hands. One of them patted her shoulder and muttered, "Maybe not such a bad idea after all." The work became rhythm. The rhythm became momentum. They raised walls taller than before, added a second wing. Someone donated tin for a roof with proper eaves. Another gave them old windows from a church demolition. Araba, long silent, showed up one morning with a stack of books and a sheepish look. Elizabeth didn't ask questions. She only handed her a hammer. The second iteration of Red Earth Academy rose not just from the ground, but from the people. They owned it now. It wasn't just hers. It was theirs. She painted a new sign, "From ashes we learn." But the work didn't stop there. Elizabeth, with her sleeves rolled and knuckles bruised, began writing again. This time not on chalkboards, but in proposals. She typed through the night on a borrowed laptop, crafting reports, outlining needs, attaching before and after photos. She told the story as it was brutal, beautiful, true. And she sent those stories everywhere. UNESCO affiliates, small-town education initiatives. No reply for weeks. Then one came. An international non-profit, Earthwise Education, replied with a single-line email. "We'd like to visit." 2 weeks later, they did. 3 representatives stepped out of a jeep with cameras, notepads, and eyes trained by years of seeing the world's most broken places. They expected rubble. They found rhythm. Children reciting poetry in English under mango trees. A group of students learning to code on a salvaged computer rigged with solar panels. A library built from bamboo shelves and filled with books in 6 languages. They walked the halls and saw charts of recycling flow. Students crafting pencil cases from plastic bottles. Girls explaining how discarded motherboards could be broken down to teach circuits. A wall labeled "From Trash to Tools." And in the center of it all stood Elizabeth. Not as a savior, not as a foreigner, but as a bridge. The youngest child, Essie, tugged on one visitor's blazer and said, "Miss Liz teaches us to make broken things useful again." That night the team stayed late. They sat in a circle under hanging lanterns and asked Elizabeth what she needed. She didn't talk about buildings. She talked about books, teacher training, meal programs, mental health counseling for children recovering from abuse. She didn't say please. She said this matters, and they listened. By dawn, she had a verbal agreement, a grant to develop a full-scale recycled education campus, the first of its kind in West Africa. It wouldn't just rebuild the school. It would fund a second building, an innovation lab, a garden for teaching agriculture, a small health clinic, and most of all, salaries for local staff, a future. She sat alone under the sky that morning, her hands dusty, her voice hoarse. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't overwhelmed, but because she didn't want to waste water when so much was still burning in her. The next week, trucks arrived, real ones, with lumber, with cement, with steel beams that glinted in the sun like backbone. Children watched from rooftops, mouths wide. Elders blessed the ground with libations. And as foundations were laid, Elizabeth stood next to Kwame, still in his sling, and said simply, "We're not a classroom anymore." He nodded. "We're a movement." In the weeks that followed, media outlets began calling. First local radio, then an Accra TV station, then Al Jazeera's education series. They asked the same thing. Why here? Why now? Why her? Elizabeth always gave the same answer. Because they deserve it. And that was all. She didn't speak of her past. Didn't mention the burned veil folded in the bottom of her trunk. Didn't explain the cost of staying, only the value of what had bloomed from it. On the first day of the newly constructed Red Earth Academy, the gates opened not to a ribbon, but to a procession. Families brought their children dressed in their best clothes. Drums played, banners fluttered. Each student entered the schoolyard and placed a stone with their name on it into the central garden, now a circular bed of red clay and white blossoms. Elizabeth watched from the doorway, Araba at her side, and behind them a wall where she had painted 5 words in bold, imperfect strokes. This place belongs to you. Not a promise, a declaration. The ashes had spoken, and from them, a revolution had begun. The letter arrived in a cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered by a man in a polished black SUV. The envelope bore no stamp, no return address, just a wax seal pressed in the shape of a globe. Elizabeth opened it, with one cautious finger reading each word slowly. The language was formal, elegant, cold. A well-established European charity had taken interest in Kwame after seeing his interview on a Ghanaian TV station. They were moved by his eloquence, his resilience, his circumstances. And now they wished to sponsor his future, a full scholarship to a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland. Flights, accommodation, legal guardianship, all arranged. They wanted to adopt him, take him somewhere safe. Elizabeth's hand trembled. She reread the letter 3 times, then found Kwame outside under the mango tree, alone sketching circuits in the dirt. When she handed him the letter, he didn't take it. He just stared at her. "I don't want to go." She blinked. "Kwame, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." "I know." "Then why?" "I have something to tell you." And in that single sentence, everything shifted. They went inside. The fan clicked lazily overhead. A distant thunder rolled like the start of a memory. He sat down slowly. "I lied about my parents," he said. Elizabeth froze. "They didn't die in a pipeline explosion." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from something deeper. A truth that had waited too long to be spoken. They were murdered. Elizabeth sat beside him, saying nothing. He stared at his hands. "My father used to work for the scrapyards. Before he knew what they were doing to kids. Before he saw the things behind the fence." His eyes went distant. "There was a man. They called him Kojo Metal. Not his real name, but everyone knew him. He ran everything, owned the yards, paid the cops, decided which boys worked where, which ones got burned." Elizabeth whispered child trafficking. Kwame nodded once. "My father confronted him, told him to stop sending the youngest ones into the fire pits, told him he'd go to the press." "What happened?" Kwame's voice lowered. 2 nights later, our shack burned. They said it was a cooking accident. But I was there. I heard the voices. I saw them pour the oil. I saw them lock the door from the outside. Elizabeth's blood went cold. I escaped through a hole in the wall. AC was already out playing. But my parents? He swallowed hard. I saw their shadows in the flames. A silence fell that no thunder could shake. Elizabeth put her hand over his. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He looked up at her then. And in his eyes was something ancient. Something that had buried itself in a boy forced to grow up in the shadows. Because no one listens when a child from the dump screams murder. She didn't speak. She couldn't. He stood across the room, pulled a shoebox from beneath his cot. Inside, scraps of old newspapers, receipts, photographs with scorched edges and a single cassette tape. He held it like a secret he'd never wanted to keep. "My father recorded one of their meetings, with Kojo. He hid the tape in my backpack. Said, 'If something happens to me, find someone who won't run.'" Elizabeth stared at the cassette. The weight of it, the consequence of it. "What's on it?" she whispered. "Proof." His voice hardened. "Proof of the kids they moved. The money. The names of the officers who were paid to look the other way." Elizabeth clutched the box, a storm rising in her chest. "We have to do something." Kwame shook his head. "They'll come after you." "I don't care." "But I do," he said quietly. Then softer still. "You're the only good thing I've ever had that stayed." Elizabeth blinked back tears. "I'm not going anywhere." But they both knew what this meant. Kojo Metal wasn't just a man. He was a system, a shadow behind 1,000 locked doors. This wasn't a fight about guardianship anymore. It was a war for truth. That night, Elizabeth stayed awake, copying the tape onto her laptop, burning duplicates onto flash drives, uploading encrypted versions to cloud servers she barely understood. She printed transcripts, made files, labeled folders with names no child should ever have to remember. She reached out to contacts in the press, the NGO who had given her the grant. a human rights lawyer she once met on a panel in Accra. All of them said the same thing. This is dangerous. And still she didn't flinch. Because if this was what Kwame had been carrying all this time, if this was the reason he walked with a quiet that could fill a cathedral, then she would carry it with him. Together. A week later, the charity that offered adoption reached out again. They insisted Kwame would be better off in Europe. Elizabeth responded with a single sentence. He's better off in the truth. The day the story broke, everything changed. The recording aired on national radio, followed by excerpts in the Ghanaian Tribune. The transcript made its way into the inbox of an international watchdog agency. There were arrests. Not many, but enough. Enough to rattle the bones of the city. Kojo Metal vanished. His compound burned. 3 officers were removed from post. 2 children previously marked as missing were found. Kwame never gave a speech, never stood before cameras. He stayed under the tree with Essie and drew maps of constellations he couldn't yet name. When Elizabeth told him the news, he didn't smile. He just asked, "Is it over?" She said no, but it's begun. He nodded and looked up at the sky. Where stars don't burn, they blaze. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the green room of Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. Elizabeth in a borrowed navy blouse, Kwame in a white tunic that looked too clean for someone who had lived most of his childhood in ash. The room was cold, air-conditioned, and too bright, humming with the static of stage lights and low conversation. A producer handed them tea neither of them touched. "This isn't a story we can air lightly," he warned. "We're not here for light," Elizabeth said. "We're here for truth." Kwame said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them had weight now. Not tension, but an understanding born from surviving something they'd never asked for. When their names were called, they stepped into the studio together, walking past framed photographs of presidents, poets, and war heroes. Elizabeth adjusted her microphone with fingers steadier than she expected. Kwame looked out across the cameras like they were just more broken machines he needed to fix. The anchor greeted them, her voice syrupy on air, but sharp off it. "You ready?" she asked. "As we'll ever be," Elizabeth replied. The interview began with pleasantries. How did Red Earth start? What challenges did they face? But then the anchor's tone shifted. "You recently came forward with allegations against a man referred to only as Kojo Metal." Kwame nodded. "Yes. And you claim he was responsible for a child labor and trafficking ring, operating out of the Agbogbloshie scrapyard." "Yes. You understand how serious these accusations are?" "I do," he said, eyes locked on hers. "I lived them." Elizabeth stepped in. "We have recordings, eyewitness statements, names. We brought everything to the authorities." "And how have they responded?" Elizabeth hesitated, then answered honestly. "With fear, some silence, some threats." The anchor blinked. "Threats." Elizabeth turned to the camera. Her voice dropped an octave. "Last week I found a message carved into my door. 3 words, go or burn." The anchor swallowed. The control room went quiet. "But I'm not leaving," Elizabeth said. Kwame nodded beside her. "Neither am I." The interview ended in a hush. There was no applause, no music, just a commercial break that came too fast and a tech assistant who couldn't look either of them in the eye. They walked out into the Accra heat, blinking under the daylight. Elizabeth reached for her phone. Messages were already pouring in, some supportive, others venomous. "White devil, liar, let the dead stay buried." She didn't flinch. Not until the phone rang with an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The voice was male, low, measured. "You should have stayed in the dirt with the rest of them." Kwame heard it too. "We're not going to be safe, are we?" Elizabeth looked at him. No, they didn't return to Red Earth that night. Instead, they stayed at a safe house provided by a journalist friend. There were no windows, just fans and walls too thin to muffle fear. At 3 a.m., Elizabeth woke to the sound of gravel scattering. She grabbed a flashlight and crept to the door. Nothing, but she knew the silence now. It was the kind that came before the next storm. By dawn, they returned to Red Earth. The gates were open, the classrooms untouched. But something had changed, an edge to the air. Then the crowds came, not attackers, not mobs, but parents, dozens of them, then hundreds. Mothers with babies strapped to their backs, fathers in faded uniforms, children clutching hand-painted signs. "We stand with Miss Liz. Red Earth belongs to us. Truth will not burn." They formed a human ring around the school, a wall of bodies, of hearts. News spread across radio, social media, community WhatsApp groups. By noon, the crowd had swelled to nearly 1,000, and still more came. They brought bread, water, prayer. Some just stood in silence, as if to say, if you come for her, you come for us. Elizabeth stood at the front gate and stared at them all. Her throat ached. Kwame stepped beside her. "You did this," he whispered. "No," she replied. "We did." In the crowd, a woman held up a baby, no more than a year old, and shouted, "She gave us a future." Another shouted back, "Let them try and take it." The chant began with one voice, then two, then hundreds. Red earth, red earth, red earth. Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled, but she stayed upright. She raised one fist in the air, and the crowd roared louder, not just for her, but for every child who had been told to be silent, for every parent who had been made to feel helpless, for every truth buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. That night no one left. They built fires and passed food between strangers. They sang under the stars. A young girl recited a poem she'd written about fire and freedom. And Elizabeth, she sat with Kwame beneath the tree where this all began. The same tree where he once drew circuits in dirt and kept his secrets to himself. "You scared?" he asked. "Always," she said, "but not alone." He nodded. The sky above them stretched wide, and for the first time in months, they slept without looking over their shoulders. Because this time the truth wasn't just theirs. It belonged to everyone now, and it would not be silenced again. The hall at the British Council in Accra was so polished it reflected the soles of shoes. Journalists hovered near the coffee stations. School counselors whispered into each other's ears. Somewhere a string quartet played something classical and forgettable. But in the center of the room, under a spotlight too bright for his liking, stood Kwame. He wore the only suit he owned, pressed that morning by Isi, with careful, trembling hands. He looked taller than he had in months, not in stature, but in stillness. Grown. The Oxford representative cleared her throat behind the podium. Kwame Mensa finalist for the Rhodes Future Scholars Initiative. "We are deeply impressed. And now we'd like to hear why you—" The room quieted. Kwame stepped forward. He could have said what they wanted. Talked about the hours spent learning by lantern light. About burning wires with bare fingers just to buy pencils. About the speech competition, the viral video, the advocacy work. But he didn't. He said, "I know what it's like to be treated like scrap." A pause. "I know what it's like to be told that where you're born is where you must stay. That survival is all you're worth. That learning is for others." More silence. But one woman didn't believe that. She walked into the ash and saw something still breathing. He looked out at the crowd, not at the suits, not at the cameras, but at her, Elizabeth, in the back, wearing the same sandals she'd rebuilt a school in. "She gave me a name before anyone else did," Kwame said. "So, if I'm going to Oxford, know that I'm going not as a success story," his voice faltered, "but as proof of someone else's sacrifice. She taught me that love doesn't always look like hugs and hand-holding. Sometimes it looks like staying when everything else burns." The room was silent. Then came the applause, not polite, not institutional, but real, thunderous. Elizabeth's hands shook as she clapped. Not because she was proud, but because she remembered the first day he wouldn't even say his name. Afterward, the director of the initiative approached her. "You raised quite a storm up there." Elizabeth smiled softly. He did the heavy lifting. "Still, we'd love to speak with you further." "Actually," he extended a card. "Oxford has been watching your work too." Elizabeth blinked. "Excuse me?" "A fellowship. University College. Visiting lecturer. Education equity in post-colonial systems. We're offering a 2-year contract." The words landed like stone. Oxford, her childhood dream. The path that vanished the moment she got on a plane and chose Ghana over grief. Now it stood again, polished, paved, prestigious. She took the card. Her fingers didn't close around it. Later that night, back at Red Earth, she found herself pacing the garden. The students had gone home. The campus slept. The mango tree whispered its usual lullaby in the wind. Kwame found her there. "You thinking about it?" She looked up. "The fellowship." He nodded. "It's Oxford," he said. "No one would blame you." "I would." Kwame tilted his head. "Why?" Elizabeth turned to face him fully, eyes bright in the moonlight. "Because I'm not chasing old dreams anymore. Ghana gave me new ones." She looked down at her hands. They were still calloused, scarred, but they were steady now. "I came here to forget who I was," she said. "But I ended up remembering who I'm supposed to be." He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because he understood what so few others ever would. Love isn't always about being chosen. Sometimes it's about choosing again and again, even when no one's watching, even when it hurts, even when you're offered everything you once thought you wanted, and still you stay. "I'm not going," Elizabeth said, slipping the card into her pocket. Kwame nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "I figured," he said. "You still have chalk on your elbow." She laughed. Then the kind of laugh that sounds like air rushing into lungs that had been under water too long. "I'll write a letter," she added, "to the board. I'll recommend someone else for the fellowship. You could recommend yourself." "I already did," she said, "right here." She looked out over the buildings, tin rooftops gleaming in the moonlight, classrooms still echoing with the sound of young voices dreaming out loud. "Red earth is enough," she whispered. Kwame stepped beside her. "It's more than enough." They stood there in silence for a long time. Two silhouettes beneath the Ghanaian sky. One who had come to forget, one who had lived to remember. And in that quiet, somewhere between dusk and dawn, they understood something deeper than contracts, or campuses, or recognition. They belonged here, not to each other, but to the place that had rebuilt them, the place that taught them how to hold fire without burning. Elizabeth didn't need a wedding dress. She didn't need a last name that matched. She didn't need an address in Oxford or a title before her name. She had a blackboard. She had children who called her Mama Liz. She had a mango tree that knew all her secrets. And she had a boy once lost in fire now standing tall in its light. Not every love story ends in marriage. Some end in purpose, and some never end at all. The air shimmered with heat, and the sky stretched wide above Red Earth Academy. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the crimson soil, now firmly packed with hundreds of footsteps. Children, parents, teachers, and neighbors gathered not for survival, but for celebration. It was graduation day, the first. 42 students in handmade gowns, stitched by mothers who once didn't believe school was a place for children like theirs. Fathers clapped with calloused hands. The choir hummed under the shade of mango trees. The air smelled of coconut, rice, and charcoal smoke, and something sweeter pride. Elizabeth sat in the front row. Her skirt dusted with red soil, her sandals faded. She wore no podium badge, no sash of honor. Just a simple necklace with 5 wooden beads, one for every year since the first fire. Kwame stepped up to the microphone, his voice once brittle with trauma, now steady with truth. "I was born in a place the world tried to forget," he began. "Where children were burned into silence, and hope was something we buried, not something we believed in." He looked out across the rows. "I didn't know how to dream. Until I met someone who saw me. Before I said a word. Before I believed I deserved to be seen." He paused. The wind caught his gown. "Her eyes didn't teach me English. Her eyes taught me how to dream." Applause erupted. But the camera didn't stay on him. It moved, slowly, gently, to Elizabeth, sitting still, hands clasped. 100 children rushed toward her. One clung to her waist. Another pressed a flower into her palm. Dozens chanted in messy unison, "Mama Liz, Mama Liz, Mama Liz." She laughed through her tears. The screen faded to a wide, aerial shot, red earth, below green trees on the edge, and a sea of children circling one woman in blue. And then over the image, in quiet white letters, "Not everyone who chooses love will be loved in return. But those who choose to stay in love will live forever." The music swelled, the image lingered, and the legend of Mama Liz. The woman who came with brokenness and stayed with conviction was sealed not in ink, not in blood, but in the soil of a country that had once been a stranger and had become her home.